The Instagram account that would later become central evidence in an international homicide investigation still exists, preserved as both digital memorial and stark warning about trust misplaced in glamorous circumstances far from home. The final posts from Riya Sharma's profile show a radiant 26-year-old Mumbai fashion designer posing against iconic Parisian backdrops, the Eiffel Tower illuminated at night, ornate interiors of a historic palace venue. Champagne flutes raised an elegant celebration, her captions documenting what began as career-defining opportunity, designing bridal party outfits for tech billionaire's lavish wedding, but transformed within hours into fatal entanglement with Paris's darker elite circles that she described in her last message as surreal connections that could change everything. The photographs from her final 24 hours alive reveal subtle changes that investigators would later identify as warning signs hidden in plain sight. Her expressions increasingly tense despite the luxurious surroundings, her poses appearing staged rather than natural, and a final image where her typically confident smile seemed replaced by something more guarded, her eyes showing what friends and family would later describe as a shadow we all missed until it was too late. Detective Henri Marchand of the Paris Police Prefecture's Elite Crimes Division would later describe the Sharma case as revealing the perfect predatory pattern that transformed what should have been career-making professional opportunity into calculated victimization that exploited cultural disorientation, isolation from support networks, and career ambition that blinded an otherwise intelligent woman to escalating danger signals in an environment where wealth and power created both irresistible allure and ultimately fatal vulnerability. The investigation uncovered methodical manipulation by Alexandre Dubois, 39-year-old art dealer, whose connections throughout Parisian high society had established pattern of problematic behavior, previously shielded from consequences through wealth, influence, and the strategic protection his social circle provided when allegations occasionally emerged, but inevitably disappeared through combination of financial settlements and subtle pressure from business associates whose own interests remained. Intertwined with maintaining Alexandre's carefully cultivated public image, regardless of private behavior patterns that insiders had observed but systematically protected from public exposure. Riya Sharma had arrived in Paris on an unusually beautiful April morning, the kind of picture-perfect spring day that fulfills every romantic Parisian fantasy and reinforces the city's reputation as world's premier destination for luxury, beauty, and artistic refinement. Her exclusive invitation to design ceremonial outfits for tech billionaire Laurent Mercier's wedding party represented career-defining opportunity for ambitious designer whose Mumbai-based luxury bridal label had garnered growing attention within India's fashion circles but lacked international recognition she desperately sought. The professional opportunity combined with Riya's lifelong fascination with Paris fashion heritage created perfect context for someone described by colleagues as perpetually balancing incredible talent with persistent insecurity about international legitimacy, vulnerability that would ultimately prove fatal when her eagerness for validation and connection within elite circles overcame natural caution that might otherwise have protected her in less status-conscious environment where apparent opportunity didn't create such powerful incentive overlooking concerning behaviors from those positioned to potentially advance her professional ambitions. The wedding celebrations at historic Château de Fontainebleau represented pinnacle of international luxury, with guest list combining European aristocracy, American tech elite, Bollywood celebrities, and the distinctive global ultra-wealthy, whose lives exist largely beyond nationality boundaries, in rarefied social stratum where traditional limitations rarely apply, and normal accountability mechanisms often fail through combination of jurisdictional complexity, financial insulation, and social networks strategically maintained through mutual protection transcending other considerations. Riya's presence within this environment simultaneously fulfilled professional dreams and created fundamental vulnerability through isolation among people operating according to unfamiliar social codes where traditional protective boundaries become easily confused through glamorous setting, normalizing behaviors that might otherwise trigger immediate caution. Text messages to friends and family during initial celebration show her genuine excitement about both professional opportunities and apparent social acceptance, with one message describing the experience as finally being recognized at level I've worked toward, These people could transform everything for the brand in just one conversation. The critical encounter that would ultimately lead to Ria's death occurred during wedding reception when Alexandre Dubois, prominent art dealer and significant financial contributor to Celebration, whose social position placed him near center of Parisian elite circles, specifically approached her after apparently noticing distinctive design elements in bridal party outfits she had created. Security footage later recovered shows initial conversation occurring in public reception area, with body language analysis suggesting professional discussion gradually transitioning toward more personal interaction, as Alexandra maintained careful physical proximity while introducing Ria to various influential guests whose connections might benefit her career ambitions. This approach, which associates would later confirm represented his typical methodology when targeting women who interested him, demonstrated sophisticated understanding regarding how career, ambition, and social validation could be weaponized, creating vulnerability through professional opportunity that ambitious individuals might pursue despite potential warning, signs that normal circumstances would have immediately triggered caution response. The digital evidence recovered from Ria's devices revealed how quickly initial professional connection evolved towards social entanglement, with messages showing invitation to exclusive afterparty at Alexandra's penthouse apartment, specifically framed as industry gathering where she might meet potential clients and influential fashion connections. Her acceptance, which friends later described as uncharacteristically impulsive, given her typically cautious approach toward unfamiliar social situations, reflected powerful influence that career opportunity represented within context, where international recognition remained her primary professional objective, despite significant success already achieved within Indian market. This vulnerability, which psychological analysts would identify as classic exploitation pattern targeting specific insecurity, created perfect opportunity for manipulation by someone whose methodology specifically involved identifying and exploiting individual vulnerability factors through initially legitimate appearing professional connection that gradually transitioned toward personal entanglement. Once trust foundation had been established through apparent career advancement possibilities that later proved entirely strategic rather than reflecting genuine professional interest. The afterparty, documented through both recovered photographs and witness statements, represented calculated environment combining legitimate industry presence, providing credibility alongside strategic isolation opportunities through multiple private areas within massive penthouse overlooking Seine River. The physical layout itself created perfect context for transitioning from public interaction toward private conversation without obvious boundary crossing that might otherwise have triggered immediate caution, with architectural design specifically featuring gradual privacy progression from main gathering space through increasingly intimate settings that guests might enter, without clearly registering significant threshold, crossing that more obvious transition might have immediately highlighted as potentially concerning. This environmental manipulation complemented psychological approach focused on professional validation and social acceptance as mechanisms creating vulnerability that Alexander's previous pattern had established as particularly effective with ambitious individuals seeking legitimacy within elite circles, where access itself often requires compromising normal caution mechanisms that might function more effectively in environments where power dynamics didn't create such significant advantage for those positioned at social hierarchies' upper levels. The witness testimony that would later become crucial during investigation came primarily from service staff present during both wedding and subsequent afterparty, with hotel employees, catering personnel, and private security, providing perspectives unaffected by social hierarchy, concerns that prevented similar candor from actual party attendees whose own social positions remained partially dependent on maintaining appropriate discretion, regardless of potentially problematic behaviors they might observe. These accounts collectively established clear pattern, showing Alexandra's initially professional approach gradually transitioning toward increasingly personal interaction, culminating in observable tension when Ria apparently attempted establishing boundaries that security personnel described witnessing as clear rejection that visibly affected Alexandra's demeanor, transitioning from charm offensive toward notably colder interaction that one server specifically reported creating sufficient concern that she considered intervention before professional requirements prevented potentially career-ending confrontation with prominent client whose influence extended throughout luxury service industry, where employment references carried particular significance within Paris's status-conscious hospitality sector. The final hours of Rhea Sharma's life remain partially obscured, despite extensive investigation, with gaps in the timeline that technological evidence couldn't completely reconstruct, despite significant surveillance camera presence throughout relevant locations. What investigators established with certainty is that approximately 32 hours after her arrival in Paris, Rhea returned to her hotel room at the five-star Le Royal Monceau, accompanied by both Alexandre Dubois and Isabelle Laurent, with security footage showing the three entering elevator together at approximately 2:17 a.m. following after-party that had transitioned from penthouse to exclusive nightclub, where witness accounts described increasingly tense interaction, suggesting conflict developing beneath superficially friendly social performance. Hotel staff reported hearing argument through room door approximately 40 minutes later, with night manager contemplating welfare check before loud music began playing inside suite, creating both concern regarding situation, escalation, and practical difficulty. Further monitoring interaction through significant sound barrier, music volume strategically established, preventing further observation that might otherwise have created intervention opportunity before situation deteriorated toward fatal conclusion. The body discovery that officially launched homicide investigation occurred when housekeeping staff entered suite following missed checkout time and lack of response to telephone communication attempts, with initial scene staging suggesting apparent overdose including strategically placed alcohol bottles, pharmaceutical remnants, and disarrangement, suggesting private party continuation rather than confrontation that forensic evidence would eventually establish had actually occurred. This staging, which temporarily succeeded, creating accidental death classification that might have permanently prevented proper investigation without Detective Marchand's experienced skepticism regarding too perfect narrative that evidence subtly contradicted, demonstrated sophisticated understanding regarding both law enforcement procedures and specific evidence requirements, distinguishing accident from homicide classifications that novice criminal typically wouldn't recognize, but which Alexandre's connections throughout Parisian elite circles, potentially including previous law enforcement officials within his social network, might have specifically educated him regarding had previous incidents occurred requiring similar knowledge application that investigation would eventually suggest might have established pattern rather than representing isolated incident, that coincidentally demonstrated such sophisticated understanding regarding both evidence manipulation and investigative procedure, vulnerability, exploitation. The fashion career that defined Rhea Sharma's identity beyond family relationships reflected extraordinary talent combined with relentless determination, with her graduation from prestigious National Institute of Fashion Technology in Mumbai, leading to apprenticeship with established designer before launching independent label, specializing in contemporary bridal wear, blending traditional Indian elements with modern silhouettes. Her distinctive aesthetic quickly garnered attention within competitive Mumbai fashion landscape, with celebrity client relationships, establishing growing profile that industry, publication, features, and social media popularity further enhanced, creating commercial success that colleagues described as particularly impressive, given her relative youth and independent operation without family connections, that often facilitate advancement within status-conscious luxury fashion industry. This professional foundation, while establishing significant domestic success, hadn't yet achieved international recognition, representing her ultimate ambition, creating context where opportunity designing for globally prominent wedding represented potential career transformation that even typically cautious personality might pursue despite potential warning signs that less consequential opportunity would likely have triggered more immediate protective response. The invitation that brought Rhea to Paris came through connection that initially appeared legitimately professional, with Laurent Mercier's celebrity wedding planner, discovering her designs through Instagram algorithm, specifically targeting luxury bridal content that platform's engagement metrics had identified as generating significant interaction among precisely demographic wedding aimed to impress. This seemingly serendipitous discovery which initially appeared representing genuine professional opportunity based solely on design merit, would later raise questions during investigation regarding whether entire scenario had been orchestrated, specifically creating vulnerability through professional opportunity too significant, refusing despite potential concerns ambitious. Designer might otherwise have recognized as requiring additional caution in unfamiliar environment without established support network. The contract offering five-figure compensation for creating specific bridal party outfits represented significant international market validation that friends described Rhea viewing as potential breakthrough moment, justifying personal financial investment covering travel expenses beyond provided accommodation that created additional pressure, ensuring professional success regardless of potential discomfort. Unfamiliar social situations might generate the pre-existing fascination with Paris fashion heritage that colleagues described as particular vulnerability factor given Rhea's simultaneous artistic reverence for tradition, alongside persistent concern regarding her designs being perceived as too Indian for truly international appeal, created perfect psychological context for manipulation by someone specifically targeting ambition and validation needs through apparent industry connections, representing potential career advancement that victims' professional aspiration made particularly difficult, refusing despite potential warning signs that less career significant opportunity might have immediately triggered protective response. This vulnerability, which psychological experts would later identify as surprisingly common among otherwise successful creative professionals whose external achievements often mask persistent internal validation, seeking that specific industry recognition can momentarily satisfy, created perfect opportunity for predator whose methodology specifically involved identifying and exploiting individual psychological vulnerability factors through initially legitimate appearing professional connection. The preparation period before Paris journey showed Rhea's typically meticulous approach toward professional opportunities, with colleagues describing intensive research regarding wedding party, individual preferences, careful material sourcing, ensuring designs met both aesthetic and practical requirements, and comprehensive planning addressing potential alterations needs that international client fitting might necessitate. This professional thoroughness contrasted significantly with uncharacteristically limited personal preparation regarding Paris itself beyond obvious tourist considerations, with friends noting her focus remained almost exclusively on professional performance aspects, rather than establishing safety protocols or support networks that previous international travels had typically featured. This singular focus on career opportunity represented departure from her usually balanced approach, suggesting powerful influence that potential international breakthrough created within psychological context, where professional legitimacy represented particularly significant validation for someone whose domestic success still hadn't completely eliminated persistent concern regarding international viability that fashion industry's hierarchical structure often reinforces through subtle status distinctions between markets, regardless of individual talent. Demonstrated, the hotel accommodation provided through wedding contract placed Rhea in five-star Le Royal Monceau, where luxury surroundings simultaneously impressed and intimidated someone whose previous international travel had featured significantly more modest arrangements, reflecting independent financing rather than client provision that current situation featured. Messages to friends during initial arrival showed both excitement regarding obvious luxury and subtle discomfort navigating environment, where staff clearly categorized guests according to perceived status within elaborate hierarchy that unfamiliar cultural context made particularly difficult interpreting accurately without local knowledge regarding specific behavioral codes and expectation patterns. This environmental disorientation, which travel psychologists identify as creating particular vulnerability through simultaneous impressive and intimidation responses that unfamiliar luxury settings often trigger, established perfect context for manipulation by individuals familiar with specific social environment who could present themselves as guides, helping navigate complex social landscape while actually creating dependency through knowledge. Asymmetry, that relationship dynamics research has established as frequently exploited vulnerability factor across various contexts where information imbalance exists. The wedding venue at historic Château de Fontainebleau represented pinnacle of French luxury cultural signaling, with 800-year royal residence, providing both spectacular setting and significant historical resonance, creating particularly impressive backdrop for celebration, specifically designed showcasing wealth and influence rather than intimate personal connection. Typical weddings prioritize regardless of financial resources involved. The professional demands navigating this environment while simultaneously managing bridal party fitting responsibilities created natural stress that friends who received Ria's messages during preparation period described as unusual, evident given her typically calm handling of professional pressure situations. This anxiety, which text messages clearly documented through uncharacteristically fragmented communication style and excessive reassurance seeking regarding design decisions previously made confidently, created additional vulnerability through psychological pressure that research has established as significantly reducing normal threat assessment capabilities, even among individuals who typically demonstrate strong protective intuition when operating under more balanced emotional conditions. The initial meeting between Ria and Alexandre Dubois occurred during wedding reception within context, where professional networking represented entirely appropriate activity that career-focused individual would naturally pursue. Despite being primarily present as service provider rather than guest position distinction, that luxury event structures typically maintain through subtle behavioral codes that unfamiliar participants might not immediately recognize, but which insiders navigate instinctively through experience within specific social context. Security footage shows Alexandra specifically approaching Ria while she observed guest reactions to bridal party outfits she had designed, with body language analysis suggesting he strategically identified moment when professional validation seeking appeared particularly evident through her attention pattern, focusing on guest responses rather than general celebration atmosphere. This targeting, which behavioral experts would later identify as demonstrating sophisticated predator methodology rather than genuine coincidental timing, suggested pattern potentially established through multiple previous implementations rather than representing isolated opportunistic approach that coincidentally demonstrated such precise vulnerability identification. The conversation progression that security footage partially captured showed classic manipulation pattern, beginning with legitimate professional discussion, providing credibility, before gradually transitioning toward more personal interaction through strategic introduction of influential industry contacts, creating significant incentive, maintaining social connection. Despite potential discomfort, warning signals might otherwise have generated. This approach, which victim psychology research has identified as particularly effective targeting ambition-motivated individuals whose career advancement potential creates powerful incentive overlooking concerning behavioral elements that different context might immediately trigger protective response toward, demonstrated sophisticated understanding regarding specific vulnerability exploitation rather than generalized charm offensive that less experienced manipulator might attempt without similar strategic precision. The footage particularly showed calculated physical positioning, gradually decreasing interpersonal distance, while maintaining plausible professional context through continuous introduction to potentially valuable industry contacts whose presence provided legitimate justification for ongoing interaction that purely social context might have lacked similar compelling continuation rationale. The invitation to exclusive afterparty that ultimately placed Ria in fatal danger came through perfect vulnerability, exploitation, with Alexandre specifically framing gathering as industry event where significant fashion contacts would be present, rather than primarily social occasion that professional focus might have more easily declined without career consequence. Concerns. This framing, which created powerful attendance incentive through explicit career advancement possibilities rather than mere social pleasure, demonstrated sophisticated understanding regarding specific motivation factors that ambitious professional would find particularly difficult refusing, despite potential discomfort unfamiliar situation might generate. The communication method itself reflected strategic approach, with invitation delivered publicly within wedding reception context, where declining might have appeared ungrateful toward hosts who had provided career significant opportunity, creating social pressure, complementing professional motivation that collectively established nearly irresistible attendance, incentive despite warning signals that different context might have generated more immediate protective response without similar career significance, creating competing priority, potentially overwhelming caution that might otherwise have prevailed. The penthouse afterparty that fatally altered Ria's trajectory represented carefully orchestrated environment, combining legitimate industry presence, providing credibility alongside strategic isolation opportunities through architectural design, specifically featuring gradual privacy progression from main gathering space through increasingly intimate settings. This environmental structure created perfect context for transitioning from public interaction toward private conversation without obvious boundary crossing that might otherwise have triggered immediate caution, with spatial layout specifically facilitating movement from highly visible central area toward increasingly secluded spaces without clear threshold, marking significant privacy change that might have otherwise activated stronger protective instincts. The guest composition itself represented strategic combination, maintaining both legitimate professional presence, justifying attendance alongside individuals, specifically selected facilitating Alexandra's methodology without providing potential protective intervention that unfamiliar but genuinely professional context might have otherwise created through industry-standard behavioral expectations regarding appropriate interaction parameters. The witness observations from service personnel present during afterparty established critical timeline elements investigation otherwise couldn't reconstruct given limited surveillance coverage throughout penthouse private areas. Staff accounts collectively documented Alexandra's consistent presence near Ria throughout evening, with multiple servers noting his drink provision despite her increasingly visible reluctance, accepting additional alcohol that several witnesses independently described, creating impression she attempted maintaining professional composure while navigating uncomfortable situation where refusal risked potential career consequences given hosts significant industry influence. That ambitious designer would reasonably fear jeopardizing through behavior that might appear ungrateful or unprofessional within unfamiliar cultural context where specific etiquette expectations remained unclear. This vulnerability, which cross-cultural research has identified as creating particular risk through uncertainty regarding appropriate boundary establishment within unfamiliar social environments, provided perfect exploitation opportunity for methodology, specifically targeting individuals navigating contexts where behavioral norms remain ambiguous, creating additional barrier toward confident boundary assertion that familiar environment might have better facilitated. The introduction of Isabelle Laurent, approximately 90 minutes into afterparty, marked significant escalation based on witness accounts describing immediately observable tension despite superficially polite interaction. Multiple staff members independently reported Isabelle's behavior, showing classic territorial response, suggesting existing relationship with Alexandra, despite his attention clearly focusing on Ria throughout evening until Isabelle's arrival visibly altered dynamic. The triangulation pattern that developed, which relationship psychology identifies as creating particularly dangerous volatility through competing attachment dynamics, established perfect context for manipulation, where Alexandra appeared maintaining simultaneous separate connections, creating potential competition dynamic that research has established as sometimes triggering validation-seeking behavior overriding normal protective instincts through insecurity activation. This manipulation demonstrated sophisticated psychological understanding beyond novice approach, suggesting pattern refinement through multiple implementations rather than coincidental interaction that happened, generating particularly volatile situation without intentional orchestration, specifically designed creating vulnerability. Through emotional manipulation, that relationship dynamic strategically established. The physical evidence recovered, despite staging attempts, provided crucial investigative foundation. Once Detective Marchand's skepticism regarding too perfect overdose narrative triggered more thorough forensic examination than initial responders had conducted based on apparent accident classification. Analysis identified subtle indicators contradicting stage scenario, including blood droplet pattern, inconsistent with self-injury, defensive tissue traces under fingernails, suggesting struggle rather than impairment, and particularly significant, specific bruising pattern around neck, showing distinctive manual strangulation indicators that experienced forensic pathologist immediately identified, despite deliberate posing, attempting obscuring this critical evidence through strategic clothing arrangement that initially successful delayed proper classification until Detective Marchand specifically requested comprehensive examination based on scene inconsistencies. His experienced observation identified as requiring additional scrutiny beyond standard protocol that apparent overdose would typically receive without similar suspicion triggering enhanced investigative response. The toxicology findings provided particularly damning evidence, contradicting staged overdose narrative. Once comprehensive screening revealed surprising substance absence rather than excessive presence, logical accident scenario would feature. Analysis showed blood alcohol levels significantly below legal impairment despite empty bottles strategically placed, suggesting excessive consumption, while pharmaceutical screening revealed complete absence. Substances staged pill containers would logically have introduced had ingestion actually occurred as staging attempted suggesting. Most significantly, specialized screening identified trace sedative presence consistent with surreptitious administration rather than voluntary consumption, with specific compound representing pharmaceutical category, rarely featured recreational use, but frequently employed in certain criminal methodologies, where victim incapacitation facilitates subsequent actions that unimpaired state would likely generate resistance, potentially preventing intended outcome that sedation specifically prevents through consciousness suppression, creating vulnerability through impairment that physical evidence clearly indicated preceded fatal. Strangulation, physical evidence conclusively established, despite staging attempts. The digital evidence recovered from Ria's devices provided crucial timeline documentation alongside significant psychological insights through message content analysis. Communications showed clear progression from initial professional excitement toward increasing discomfort, with text messages to close friend in Mumbai approximately 40 minutes before returning to hotel, showing explicit concern regarding Alexandra's behavior, described as getting weird and pushy about going somewhere private, while expressing uncertainty navigating situation without damaging important industry connections, his influence potentially controlled. This communication, representing last independent contact before returning to hotel with both Alexandre and Isabel, demonstrated both clear consent absence regarding whatever subsequent interaction staging attempted suggesting, and specific concern documentation indicating victim clearly recognized potential danger but faced significant career consequence dilemma that created vulnerability through professional opportunity that simultaneously represented both legitimate career advancement mechanism and perfect manipulation opportunity that predator methodology specifically exploited through calculated approach, leveraging professional ambition against personal safety, that competing priorities unfortunately resolved favoring career considerations with ultimately fatal consequences. The surveillance footage recovered from multiple locations established crucial movement timeline despite significant gaps resulting from both coverage limitations and apparent deliberate camera avoidance, showing sophisticated understanding regarding monitoring system vulnerabilities. Hotel security captured the three entering building together at 2:17 a.m., with body language analysis showing clear tension despite superficial social appearance maintained in public areas. Additional significant footage came from nightclub visited between penthouse and hotel, where cameras captured interaction showing visibly intoxicated Isabel, appearing confrontational toward Ria, while Alexandre physically positioned himself between them in manner behavioral analysts described as demonstrating control rather than protection, despite superficial appearance potentially suggesting latter to casual observation without professional analysis, identifying specific dominance indicators experienced, evaluators immediately recognized as concerning. This behavioral evidence corroborated witness accounts describing increasingly uncomfortable interaction dynamic developing throughout evening, despite maintained public composure that social pressure and professional opportunity considerations appeared motivating. Despite clearly documented private concern, Ria's messages to friends had explicitly expressed before communication abruptly ceased, approximately 20 minutes before hotel return surveillance footage documented. The hotel room evidence provided most definitive homicide indicators once proper forensic examination occurred, following Detective Marchand's initial classification rejection that triggered comprehensive processing beyond standard protocol. Apparent accident would typically receive. Blood evidence revealed through specialized luminol application showed cleaning attempt sophisticated enough, removing visible traces, but insufficient, eliminating microscopic residue. Enhanced detection methods identified despite deliberate sanitization, reflecting knowledge beyond typical civilian awareness, but insufficient countering advanced forensic techniques. Particularly significant was evidence distribution throughout bathroom, indicating struggle initiating there before moving toward bedroom where body was found. Contradicting staged scenario, suggesting voluntary substance consumption in latter location, that physical evidence patterns conclusively disproved through scientific analysis, establishing struggle timeline that staging specifically attempted concealing through strategic evidence, manipulation that initially delayed proper classification before Detective Marchand's experienced assessment triggered enhanced examination, revealing truth beneath deliberately constructed false narrative that less thorough investigation might never have penetrated, given sophisticated staging, reflecting knowledge beyond typical criminal methodology. The financial investigation revealed significant unexplained transaction from Alexandra's account to Isabel's approximately 6 hours after estimated time of death, but before body discovery, suggesting potential compensation or evidence concealment financing requiring immediate transfer, that standard transaction patterns wouldn't typically feature during early morning hours without specific urgency motivating atypical timing. Normal behavior patterns wouldn't include without significant motivation, creating immediate completion, necessity, normal circumstances wouldn't generate. This financial evidence provided important investigative direction, leading toward Isabel's eventual cooperation. That case resolution critically required, given evidence limitations that accomplice testimony significantly resolved through detailed account, providing elements physical evidence alone couldn't fully establish, despite scientific analysis, clearly indicating homicide occurred through specific methodology, staging attempted concealing before proper investigation revealed truth beneath deliberately constructed false narrative that accomplice testimony ultimately confirmed while providing additional details regarding both specific incident circumstances and potential previous similar situations that charging considerations ultimately motivated Isabel, revealing despite self-incrimination concerns that negotiated cooperation agreement successfully addressed through prosecutors' strategic approach, prioritizing primary perpetrator accountability that accomplice testimony critically facilitated. The recovery of deleted communications between Alexandra and Isabel through specialized digital forensics revealed damning evidence showing explicit conversation regarding both incident and subsequent cover-up strategy, with messages exchanged during period between estimated time of death and body discovery, showing clear acknowledgement regarding fatality alongside specific discussion about staging, implementation, ensuring accident classification. That initial response nearly provided before Detective Marchand's intervention prevented successful investigation derailment that nearly occurred, despite evidence sophisticated staging couldn't completely eliminate once proper examination occurred. The communication content showed not only explicit incident acknowledgement but specific reference, suggesting potential previous similar situations through language indicating established protocol, rather than panicked improvisation that isolated incident would more likely generate without prior experience, informing response methodology that digital evidence strongly suggested existed based on communication content analysis, showing calm, methodical approach, inconsistent with first-time crisis response that behavioral analysis would expect, demonstrating significantly different communication pattern than recovered messages clearly displayed. The investigative approach that Detective Marchand implemented faced significant institutional resistance, reflecting both elite protection patterns within certain Parisian police departments and resource limitations affecting case prioritization involving foreign visitors without diplomatic pressure, ensuring appropriate attention. His personal commitment to case resolution, despite these obstacles, represented professional dedication, transcending institutional limitations, with his methodical approach systematically overcoming official reluctance. through carefully documented evidence development, establishing clear homicide determination that jurisdictional authorities could no longer reasonably dismiss as an accidental death. Once comprehensive case building created irrefutable evidence pattern requiring official acknowledgement and appropriate response allocation despite institutional preference for less complicated explanation that tourism and diplomatic considerations might have otherwise favored absent compelling evidence, contradicting accident classification that initial response had nearly permanently established before Detective Marchand's intervention prevented successful investigation derailment. The international pressure that ultimately ensured appropriate investigative resource allocation emerged primarily through social media campaign orchestrated by Ria's sister Mira, whose strategic approach combining emotional appeal through personal storytelling with systematic communication, targeting media outlets, diplomatic channels, and fashion industry influences created multi-layered pressure, impossible to dismiss through standard redirection techniques officials might otherwise have employed to minimize potential diplomatic complications or tourism impact. The campaign's effectiveness particularly reflected Mira's professional communication background, with her public relations experience enabling sophisticated strategy development that simultaneously generated public awareness, creating accountability pressure while engaging appropriate diplomatic channels, ensuring official attention without creating unnecessarily antagonistic approach that might have hindered rather than facilitated cooperation necessary for effective investigation within foreign jurisdiction, where family lacked direct influence beyond pressure, mechanisms strategically deployed through carefully constructed campaign, balancing emotional appeal with diplomatic engagement. The evidence collection process faced significant challenges given both initial accident classification that delayed proper crime scene processing and apparent sophisticated sanitization efforts reflecting knowledge beyond typical civilian awareness but insufficient, countering advanced forensic techniques. Detective Marchand specifically requested, once his suspicion triggered, enhanced examination beyond standard protocol. Apparent accident would typically receive without similar concerns prompting additional scrutiny. The recovery of critical evidence despite these complications demonstrated both exceptional forensic team performance and Detective Marchand's strategic direction, prioritizing specific examination areas his experience identified as potentially revealing, despite apparent cleaning, attempting evidence elimination that partially succeeded, removing obvious indicators but proved insufficient, eliminating microscopic residue. Specialized detection methods identified once properly applied through comprehensive processing. Initial classification hadn't triggered before. Investigation reclassification changed. Applicable protocols enabling more thorough examination, revealing truth beneath deliberately constructed false narrative. The witness testimony that transformed theoretical case into prosecutable homicide came through Detective Marchand's methodical community canvassing, extending beyond obvious participants toward service personnel present throughout relevant locations, with hotel staff, event workers, and nightclub employees providing crucial observations regarding interaction patterns. Principals had demonstrated throughout evening preceding fatal incident. This approach, which prioritized individuals lacking social connection, protecting Alexandra through either relationship maintenance concerns or industry influence considerations, yielded candid accounts that guest interviews conspicuously failed, providing, despite similar observation opportunities, their statements suspiciously omitted through apparent collective agreement, maintaining strategic silence, protecting influential figure whose connections potentially affected multiple witnesses' professional prospects within industry, where reputation and access often determine career trajectories that speaking against prominent individual might significantly compromise without whistleblower protections, that practical enforcement realities often render insufficient. Despite theoretical protection mechanisms legal frameworks might nominally provide without practical implementation, effectiveness, social hierarchy, often prevents, despite regulatory intention. The strategic approach toward Isabelle Laurent represented critical investigative direction, once financial evidence suggested her potential involvement through significant transaction timing, indicating possible compensation or evidence. Concealment financing occurring before body discovery, but after estimated time of death. The interrogation methodology Detective Marchand implemented demonstrated sophisticated psychological understanding regarding relationship dynamics, potentially creating cooperation opportunity through strategic emphasis on potential betrayal implications that transaction timing suggested alongside careful explanation regarding differential legal consequences. Primary perpetrator versus accomplice, typically face within French judicial system that experienced prosecutor had specifically authorized communicating, creating powerful incentive cooperation that eventually succeeded, producing critical testimony, providing elements physical evidence alone couldn't fully establish, despite scientific analysis, clearly indicating homicide occurred through specific methodology. Staging attempted concealing before proper investigation revealed truth beneath deliberately constructed false narrative that accomplice testimony ultimately confirmed, while providing additional details regarding both specific incident circumstances and potential previous similar situations that charging considerations ultimately motivated. Isabel revealing despite self-incrimination concerns. The digital forensics that provided crucial investigative foundation required exceptional technical expertise, navigating both encryption challenges and apparent deletion attempts, sophisticated enough defeating standard recovery methods, but insufficient countering specialized techniques that experienced cyber investigation units successfully implemented once Detective Marchand secured necessary resource allocation that institutional resistance had initially limited before mounting evidence, compelled appropriate authorization, despite apparent administrative reluctance proper. A case pursuit otherwise faced without compelling evidence, overcoming institutional inertia that elite protection patterns sometimes create within enforcement structures where social hierarchy considerations occasionally influence operational priorities despite professional ethics, theoretically preventing such influence that practical realities sometimes allow affecting resource allocation decisions that specialized investigation requirements often depend upon. Securing despite administrative hurdles, investigations involving prominent individuals sometimes encounter before evidence becomes sufficiently compelling. Overriding protection mechanisms, social status occasionally provides with imperfect systems, where theoretical equality before law meets practical application complexities. Real-world enforcement sometimes demonstrates, despite ideal standards, legal frameworks nominally establish. The hotel manager Pierre Lefebvre's decision leaking surveillance footage showing Ria returning to room with both Alexandra and Isabel represented crucial turning point, generating sufficient public pressure, ensuring investigation continuation. Despite initial institutional resistance, proper pursuit otherwise faced without visibility, creating accountability pressure that leaked evidence specifically generated once media distribution occurred through anonymous channels, protection, whistleblower identity, while providing critical visual evidence contradicting Alexandra's initial statement, claiming no hotel room presence that surveillance footage conclusively disproved through clear visual documentation, establishing his presence precisely where initial statements explicitly denied being during relevant time frame. That digital evidence irrefutably established through timestamp verification technical analysis confirmed authentic, despite defense attempts challenging admissibility based on acquisition methodology that judicial review ultimately permitted. Despite procedural concerns, defense legitimately raised regarding chain of custody standards leaked evidence technically violated before official investigation, secured original copies through proper channels that admissibility requirements typically demand without public pressure, necessitating alternative approach that leaked footage being specifically created through exposure, generating sufficient attention, ensuring official investigation properly pursued evidence might otherwise have remained unexamined without visibility, creating accountability requirements that public awareness specifically established once media distribution occurred. The diplomatic complications that investigation navigated reflected both victims' Indian citizenship, creating international dimensions, and Alexandra's connections throughout Parisian elite circles, including government officials whose interests sometimes appeared conflicting with thorough investigation. That potential embarrassment risked generating without careful approach, balancing justice requirements against diplomatic sensitivity, ensuring appropriate case pursuit without unnecessary complication. Official relationships otherwise faced if investigation appeared targeting prominent individuals without sufficient evidence justifying such approach. That methodical case building specifically established through comprehensive evidence development, Detective Marchand strategically prioritized creating foundation that even well-connected individuals couldn't easily dismiss once properly documented. Despite initial protection attempts, various associates apparently attempted implementing before evidence became sufficiently compelling override influence considerations that early investigation stages had encountered, requiring exceptional persistence, overcoming institutional resistance, proper case pursuit, otherwise faced without detectives' personal commitment, ensuring appropriate attention. Despite administrative obstacles, investigation initially encountered before evidence development created sufficient momentum, ensuring continuation despite apparent reluctance. Certain officials demonstrated before case strength, eliminated protection, possibilities social status might otherwise have provided absent compelling evidence, contradicting accident, classification, initial response nearly permanently established. The formal interrogation of Alexandre Dubois marked significant case development once evidence accumulation created sufficient foundation, compelling his participation despite initial avoidance attempts. Both legal representation and social connections had temporarily facilitated before investigation. Momentum eliminated delay possibilities, otherwise available through procedural mechanisms. Defense counsel typically employs preventing client questioning until absolutely necessary. That evidence development eventually ensured, despite sophisticated resistance case progression otherwise encountered. The questioning strategy Detective Marchand implemented demonstrated exceptional psychological understanding regarding status-conscious personalities, with approach specifically designed triggering narcissistic response patterns through calculated challenge, prestigious self-image that behavioral analysis identified as particular vulnerability expert interrogator could potentially exploit, creating cooperation opportunity through emotional manipulation. That individual's psychology specifically facilitated once properly approached through methodology, targeting known vulnerability factors, personality assessment, had identified susceptible strategic exploitation that experienced investigator recognized potentially productive, despite subject's apparent sophistication. That psychological training suggested specific approach might nevertheless overcome through targeted methodology. Addressing particular characteristics assessment had established relevant, despite subject's obvious intelligence, that emotional patterns potentially rendered exploitable through appropriate psychological triggers properly implemented. The evidence presentation during interrogation followed strategic escalation pattern, beginning with easily dismissed elements before systematically introducing increasingly difficult challenges, culminating with surveillance footage that initial denials had explicitly contradicted, creating significant credibility damage. Defense counsel recognized requiring strategy adjustment from complete denial toward alternative narrative. Once presence became impossible, disputing without damaging overall defense, requiring explanation consistency that changed circumstances suddenly demanded, given evidence conclusively establishing elements. Initial statements had explicitly denied despite representation specifically advising against recorded assertions that subsequent evidence directly contradicted, creating significant credibility challenges. Defense narrative subsequently faced convincing alternative explanation, attempting providing despite foundation damage. Initial misrepresentation had unnecessarily created before evidence conclusively established facts, directly contradicting recorded statements that experienced counsel would typically prevent without client insistence overriding. Professional recommendation that narcissistic personalities sometimes demonstrate despite representation, specifically advising against assertions. Evidence might subsequently contradict exactly as investigation ultimately established. Through comprehensive documentation, contradicting initial statements, electronic evidence, timestamp verification, conclusively established, deliberately false, rather than reflecting genuine memory limitations, good faith errors might otherwise explain without credibility implications. False statements typically create once deliberately deceptive intent becomes clearly established through objective evidence, contradicting recorded assertions without plausible alternative explanation. Defense narrative subsequently attempted providing, despite limited options, initial denials created once evidence conclusively established, presence previously explicitly denied. The Breakthrough confession from Isabelle Laurent came through strategic cooperation agreement. Prosecutor's office developed once financial evidence suggested her potential secondary involvement, that transaction timing specifically indicated given transfer occurring after estimated time of death. But before body discovery, creating powerful leverage, Detective Marchand specifically exploited through interrogation approach, emphasizing potential primary culpability. Evidence might otherwise suggest without cooperation, providing alternative explanation that legal representation recognized potentially advantageous given circumstances that evidence development had created without client's prior consultation, that experienced counsel immediately recognized requiring strategic response, protecting client interests, that cooperation agreement specifically facilitated once properly negotiated, ensuring appropriate consideration regarding reduced charges, that accomplice status potentially justified given evidence suggesting secondary rather than primary involvement, that testimony potentially established once properly documented through formal agreement, that prosecutorial discretion specifically permitted offering, given case priorities focused on primary perpetrator, that accomplice testimony critically facilitated, establishing despite potential self-incrimination concerns that negotiated cooperation agreement successfully addressed through prosecutor's strategic approach, prioritizing primary perpetrator accountability, that accomplice testimony critically established that cooperation agreement specifically incentivized through significant sentencing considerations, that legal representation appropriately secured before client provided detailed account regarding both specific incident circumstances and potential previous similar situations. Charging considerations ultimately motivated Isabelle, revealing despite self-incrimination concerns that negotiated agreement successfully balanced against potential consequences. Cooperation specifically reduced through prosecutor's strategic prioritization, that defense counsel effectively leveraged, ensuring client interests received appropriate consideration, that circumstances specifically justified, given evidence value testimony, provided that case resolution critically required, given limitations, physical evidence alone presented without accomplice, account providing critical details, scientific analysis couldn't independently establish, despite clearly indicating homicide. Methodology staging, attempted concealing. The detailed account Isabelle provided once cooperation agreement ensured appropriate consideration, revealed disturbing pattern regarding both specific incident circumstances and previous similar situations that prosecution had suspected, but lacked concrete evidence establishing before testimony, provided crucial details. Physical evidence alone couldn't conclusively document, despite scientific analysis, clearly indicating staging inconsistent with accident classification, that initial response nearly permanently established before Detective Marchand's intervention prevented successful investigation derailment that nearly occurred despite evidence sophisticated staging couldn't completely eliminate. Her testimony particularly established clear premeditation through detailed description regarding both sedative administration Ria hadn't knowingly consumed and subsequent strangulation Alexandre had personally implemented once victim reached sufficient impairment, preventing effective resistance, that toxicology findings had scientifically established through comprehensive screening, identifying specific compound presence, consistent with testimony account that physical evidence independently confirmed through bruising pattern analysis. Medical examiner had documented despite staging attempts concealing through strategic clothing arrangement that experienced pathologist nevertheless identified. Once comprehensive examination occurred following Detective Marchand specifically requesting complete autopsy that standard protocol apparent accident wouldn't typically receive without special request that detective's suspicion fortunately triggered before body release, that standard procedure would otherwise have implemented without similar intervention, potentially permanently preventing crucial evidence. Documentation autopsy specifically established that case resolution critically required. The additional pattern evidence Isabelle's testimony established proved particularly significant regarding prosecution approach, with her account documenting at least 2 previous incidents involving similar methodology that formal complaints had never resulted from, despite victims apparently receiving substantial financial settlements. Legal documentation subsequently confirmed through financial investigation that court orders specifically authorized once Testimony provided sufficient foundation, justifying records access, that privacy protections would otherwise have prevented, without specific cause. Initial account established that subsequent evidence independently verified through comprehensive financial analysis, documenting payment patterns, consistent with testimony that bank records objectively confirmed, once appropriate legal authorization, ensured investigator access that privacy regulations would typically prevent without court order, that judge specifically issued based on testimony providing sufficient justification, that subsequent evidence validated through independent verification, financial records provided once legal authorization permitted appropriate access, that investigation otherwise lacked without testimony, establishing specific pattern, justifying records examination that financial documentation subsequently confirmed through objective analysis, establishing payment timing consistent with dates. Testimony had specifically identified that independent evidence subsequently verified through comprehensive examination records provided once court order, specifically authorized access, that investigation appropriately utilized, developing additional evidence. Supporting pattern testimony had initially established that subsequent documentation objectively confirmed through independent verification. The arrest of Alexandre Dubois occurred following comprehensive evidence development, ensuring successful prosecution once case proceeded toward trial, with Operation specifically addressing both flight risk assessment and potential evidence. Destruction concerns that wealth and connections potentially facilitated without appropriate intervention, preventing through strategic approach, ensuring subject remained available throughout legal proceedings, that evidence suggested he might otherwise attempt avoiding, given both resources and international connections, providing potential escape mechanisms that affluence specifically enables without proper response, preventing through appropriate measures that circumstances justified, once evidence conclusively established, likely culpability, that investigation had methodically documented through comprehensive case building. Detective Marchand had strategically implemented, creating prosecution foundation that even exceptional legal representation couldn't easily overcome, given evidence quality. Methodical investigation had specifically developed, ensuring successful prosecution despite defense resources that wealth typically provides, creating significant advantage that thorough evidence development nevertheless overcame through exceptional investigation quality. That Detective Marchand's commitment specifically ensured, despite institutional obstacles, case initially faced before momentum created, sufficient pressure ensuring appropriate resource allocation, that complete case building ultimately received despite initial resistance that politics and influence had temporarily created before evidence became sufficiently compelling, overriding protection mechanisms social status occasionally provides within imperfect systems. The public response following arrest demonstrated concerning pattern regarding media treatment between perpetrators and victims, that privilege and social position often influence, with numerous publications initially emphasizing Alexandre's professional accomplishments and social standing, while simultaneously focusing on Ria's appearance and nationality, in ways creating subtle narrative inequality that social media quickly identified through critical analysis, highlighting problematic framing that subsequent coverage gradually improved following public criticism, specifically addressing unequal treatment that unconscious bias potentially explained without assuming deliberate misrepresentation, that systemic patterns nevertheless reinforced without appropriate awareness regarding differential treatment privileged individuals often receive within reporting, that professional standards theoretically prevent without consistently achieving through practical application. That critical feedback specifically addressed creating accountability pressure, that improved coverage subsequently demonstrated once problematic patterns received appropriate identification, that media response gradually reflected through more balanced representation. Subsequent reporting provided after initial criticism highlighted concerning disparities, that public feedback specifically identified, ensuring improved approach that professional standards theoretically required without consistently achieving, absent specific accountability mechanisms that social media criticism effectively provided through collective response, highlighting problematic elements, Initial coverage had unfortunately demonstrated, despite journalistic principles, theoretically preventing such inequality, that practical application sometimes fails achieving without external feedback, creating necessary awareness regarding unconscious patterns. Professional training alone sometimes proves insufficient, preventing without additional accountability specific criticism provides. The trial of Alexandre Dubois became international media sensation once proceedings formally commenced, with coverage spanning both traditional outlets and social media platforms, ensuring unprecedented visibility that both Indian and French governmental representatives monitored, ensuring appropriate case handling that diplomatic considerations might otherwise have complicated without public attention, creating accountability requirements that visibility specifically established through comprehensive coverage that language barriers might otherwise have limited without international media interest, ensuring multilingual reporting that worldwide audience accessed, creating transparency pressure, appropriate proceedings required, preventing potential interference that connections might otherwise have facilitated absent public scrutiny, creating accountability foundation that open coverage specifically provided through detailed reporting that justice requirements specifically benefited from through transparency, mechanisms, visibility, created ensuring appropriate process implementation that fairness standards specifically required, despite influence considerations that closed proceedings might potentially have encountered without public observation, creating necessary accountability. That case resolution critically required, given both international dimensions and social position, defendant maintained that influence concerns potentially created without transparency, mechanisms comprehensive coverage, specifically provided through detailed reporting that justice standards benefited from through visibility, ensuring appropriate implementation procedural requirements specifically demanded. The evidence presentation prosecution methodically developed, followed strategic progression, establishing clear narrative through carefully structured witness testimony, forensic documentation, and electronic evidence, creating comprehensive foundation that even exceptional defense representation couldn't effectively counter. Despite sophisticated challenges, legal teams specifically raised throughout proceedings that procedural mechanisms provided without successfully undermining core evidence that investigation had methodically established through Detective Marchand's strategic direction, ensuring appropriate documentation that courtroom presentation specifically highlighted through effective prosecutorial organization that judge specifically commended regarding professional quality that complex international case particularly required given both technical elements and jurisdictional complications that comprehensive preparation successfully addressed through exceptional case development that methodical investigation had specifically ensured through thorough evidence collection that prosecution effectively utilized, developing persuasive narrative that testimony, physical evidence, and electronic documentation collectively established beyond reasonable doubt, standard that criminal proceedings specifically required meeting, despite defense challenges that procedural mechanisms appropriately provided without successfully undermining core evidence that investigation had comprehensively established through exceptional professionalism, that courtroom presentation effectively highlighted creating compelling narrative that even skilled representation couldn't successfully counter. Despite procedural challenges, defense appropriately raised throughout proceedings that legal mechanisms specifically permitted without ultimately prevailing, given evidence quality. Methodical investigation had specifically developed, ensuring successful prosecution despite defense resources that wealth typically provides. The defense strategy centered on alternative narrative attempting establishing despite evidence limitations, with approach specifically emphasizing accident possibility that staging had deliberately suggested before investigation, revealed inconsistencies that thorough examination specifically identified contradicting manufactured scenario that physical evidence scientifically disproved through comprehensive forensic analysis, that courtroom testimony effectively communicated, despite technical complexity, that expert witnesses successfully explained, ensuring juror understanding, regarding critical elements that prosecution case specifically required establishing beyond reasonable doubt standard that criminal proceedings demanded meeting. The approach particularly attempted creating uncertainty regarding specific roles, despite Isabel's testimony clearly establishing through detailed account that physical evidence independently corroborated through scientific analysis, confirming critical elements that accomplice statement had specifically described regarding both sedative administration, toxicology findings, verified and strangulation implementation, that autopsy results conclusively documented despite staging attempts concealing through clothing arrangement, that experienced pathologist nevertheless identified once comprehensive examination occurred following Detective Marchand, specifically requesting complete autopsy that standard protocol apparent accident wouldn't typically receive without special request, that detective suspicion fortunately triggered before body release that case resolution critically required. The testimony from Meera Sharma regarding both victims' character and family impact provided crucial humanizing elements, ensuring proceedings recognized actual person behind clinical evidence discussion that technical testimony sometimes inadvertently minimizes without personal dimension. Specific inclusion establishes preventing potential dehumanization that complex proceedings sometimes unintentionally create without deliberate efforts maintaining human connection that victim impact testimony specifically provides through personal perspective that proceedings particularly benefit, including despite emotional difficulty that family members experience providing despite importance ensuring justice system properly acknowledges actual individuals that crimes affect beyond abstract consideration. That comprehensive understanding particularly requires recognizing through direct testimony that proceedings specifically benefit, including despite challenging nature that family members experience, providing that justice process nevertheless requires incorporating, ensuring appropriate consideration regarding human dimensions that technical evidence alone sometimes inadequately conveys without personal testimony, specifically establishing through direct communication that proceedings particularly benefit, including despite emotional difficulty that testimony necessarily creates that justice requirements nevertheless justify given importance, ensuring system properly acknowledges actual individuals that criminal acts affect beyond abstract consideration, that comprehensive understanding particularly demands recognizing through direct testimony that court specifically benefits hearing despite challenging nature that family members experience providing that justice process nevertheless requires incorporating, ensuring appropriate acknowledgement. The verdict determination process required jury navigating both complex evidence and international dimensions that deliberation necessarily addressed through careful consideration regarding technical elements that scientific testimony had established alongside witness accounts that personal testimony had provided, creating comprehensive understanding that appropriate judgment specifically required, developing through thorough evidence evaluation that deliberation process specifically facilitated through structured discussion that French legal system particularly emphasizes, ensuring appropriate consideration regarding all relevant factors that judgment necessarily incorporates before reaching final determination that justice standards specifically require, reflecting through verdict, that evidence quality ultimately determines, despite procedural challenges that defense appropriately raises throughout proceedings that legal mechanisms specifically permit without necessarily prevailing, given evidence quality that methodical investigation specifically develops, ensuring appropriate outcome that facts properly dictate through comprehensive documentation that thorough investigation effectively establishes creating foundation that deliberation process specifically evaluates through careful consideration that justice requirements particularly demand, ensuring verdict properly reflects evidence that proceedings comprehensively present through testimony, documentation, and analysis collectively establishing narrative that jury specifically assesses determining appropriate judgment that system ultimately delivers through verdict that evidence quality principally determines despite procedural elements that defense necessarily challenges throughout proceedings that legal mechanisms specifically permit without necessarily succeeding, given foundation quality that proper investigation methodically develops, ensuring appropriate outcome that facts specifically justify through comprehensive documentation. The guilty verdict that jury ultimately delivered following 6 hours deliberation reflected evidence quality investigation had methodically established, despite defense challenges throughout proceedings that legal mechanisms appropriately provided without successfully undermining core elements that comprehensive case building had effectively documented through Detective Marchand's strategic direction, ensuring appropriate evidence development that prosecution effectively utilized, creating compelling narrative that testimony, physical evidence, and electronic documentation collectively supported beyond reasonable doubt standard that criminal proceedings specifically required meeting. The conviction on premeditated murder, charges that evidence clearly established, created foundation for sentencing phase that French legal system subsequently addressed through separate proceedings that judicial determination primarily resolved through structured evaluation, that legal framework specifically guided, ensuring appropriate punishment, that crime severity, evidence quality, and legal standards collectively justified through comprehensive consideration, that sentencing determination specifically reflected through ultimate judgment, that justice requirements properly guided, despite influence considerations that wealth and status sometimes affect within imperfect systems that public visibility helped, ensuring appropriate implementation through accountability pressure, that transparency specifically created through international attention case, particularly generated given both victim nationality and perpetrator prominence, that media coverage comprehensively documented throughout proceedings, that judgment ultimately reflected through sentence, that evidence, quality, and legal standards properly determined, despite status factors that influence occasionally effects, without successfully overriding justice requirements, that visibility helped, ensuring through accountability mechanisms that transparency specifically establishes preventing potential interference, that connections might otherwise facilitate absent public scrutiny, creating necessary accountability. The 30-year imprisonment sentence that judgment ultimately imposed represented appropriate punishment. French legal system specifically provided addressing crime severity. Evidence had comprehensively established through thorough investigation that courtroom proceedings effectively communicated, despite technical complexity, that testimony successfully explained, ensuring proper understanding regarding critical elements that sentencing determination specifically required, acknowledging through punishment that circumstances justified, given premeditation, evidence had clearly established that judge specifically referenced during sentencing statement, that court transcript documented, ensuring appropriate record regarding factors determination, specifically considered, establishing clear foundation that potential appeals necessarily addressed through comprehensive documentation, that proceedings methodically maintained throughout case development, that judgment specifically referenced, ensuring appropriate context regarding factors determination, particularly incorporated through detailed explanation, that sentencing statement specifically provided, creating thorough record that justice standards particularly required, maintaining through comprehensive documentation, that proceedings systematically preserved, ensuring appropriate foundation, that potential challenges necessarily addressed through complete record, that legal proceedings methodically maintained throughout case development, that final judgment specifically referenced, ensuring proper context regarding elements determination, particularly incorporated that sentencing explanation, comprehensively provided through detailed statement that justice requirements specifically demanded, including despite defense objections, that procedural mechanisms appropriately permitted, raising without ultimately prevailing, given evidence quality, methodical investigation, had specifically established, ensuring appropriate outcome, that facts properly justified through comprehensive documentation. The secondary judgment regarding Isabelle Laurent reflected cooperation agreement. Prosecutor's office had specifically developed once financial evidence suggested her involvement, that transaction timing particularly indicated given transfer occurring after estimated time of death, but before body discovery, creating powerful leverage. Detective Marchand specifically exploited through interrogation approach. That testimony subsequently provided that case resolution critically required given evidence limitations that accomplice account specifically addressed, providing crucial details. Physical evidence alone couldn't conclusively establish, despite clearly indicating homicide methodology staging, attempted concealing that testimony, particularly confirmed while providing additional pattern evidence regarding previous incidents that prosecution had suspected but lacked concrete documentation proving before accomplice statement, provided critical information that subsequent financial investigation independently verified through comprehensive analysis that banking records specifically confirmed once court order authorized appropriate access that privacy regulations would otherwise have prevented without specific justification testimony established, creating foundation that judge specifically acknowledged during sentencing determination that cooperation agreement appropriately reflected through 8-year imprisonment judgment that circumstances particularly justified, given both involvement evidence clearly established and cooperation value case resolution, specifically required that sentence reduction appropriately. Acknowledged through judgment that proportionality standards specifically supported given differential culpability that testimony and evidence collectively indicated despite serious nature accomplice. Participation nevertheless demonstrated that primary responsibility evidence clearly established, rested with Alexandra that sentencing differential appropriately reflected through judgment, that proportionality requirements specifically supported given respective roles, evidence, comprehensively documented. The enduring impact of Ria Sharma's case extended far beyond individual justice resolution to inspire systematic improvements in both international traveler safety measures and institutional responses when prevention efforts fail, creating meaningful legacy that transformed personal tragedy into catalyst for changes, potentially protecting countless future travelers from similar victimization. The Ria Sharma Foundation, established by her family with support from both Indian and French partners, developed comprehensive education programs addressing realistic risk awareness without promoting fear-based isolation, culturally informed safety strategies, balancing professional ambition with appropriate boundaries, and resource identification, ensuring travelers know how to access assistance if concerning situations develop during international experiences. These initiatives specifically targeted gap between generic travel safety advice and practical reality of professional opportunities in unfamiliar environments, providing nuanced guidance, acknowledging both genuine career advancement possibilities and specific vulnerability factors, requiring thoughtful navigation rather than either fearful avoidance or naive assumption that professional settings automatically provide safety. That independent verification sometimes proves necessary, ensuring, despite apparent legitimacy, that additional confirmation might specifically establish preventing dangerous situations. Ambition sometimes inadvertently creates, through vulnerability, professional opportunity, potentially generates without a prior caution, balancing career advancement against personal safety, that competing priorities sometimes unfortunately resolve favoring career considerations with potentially dangerous consequences that proper education might effectively prevent through specific awareness regarding vulnerability factors that ambitious professionals particularly benefit understanding, despite success, sometimes creating confidence, potentially overriding caution, that unfamiliar environments specifically require maintaining despite professional accomplishment, sometimes suggesting unnecessary through false security. Successful experience potentially creates without appropriate awareness regarding specific risk factors. That education particularly addresses preventing dangerous situations, that proper preparation effectively reduces through concrete knowledge application, that foundation initiatives specifically develop promoting through comprehensive resources. Ambitious professionals particularly benefit accessing, despite success, sometimes creating confidence, potentially overriding caution, that unfamiliar environments specifically require maintaining through deliberate awareness. Education particularly facilitates developing. The psychological healing process for Ria's family created complex challenges, extending beyond normal grief complications, with traumatic circumstances, international dimensions, and awareness regarding system failures, potentially preventing tragedy, creating particularly difficult recovery, requiring specialized support, addressing both loss processing and justice engagement, spanning international boundaries, creating additional complexity beyond typical grief resolution processes. The support resources specifically developed through community organizations establishing Memorial Foundation, addressing both Ria's specific case and broader traveler safety needs, created meaningful framework, transforming tragedy into prevention opportunity that family members described, providing partial healing through purpose development, ensuring Ria's experience might protect others from similar vulnerability despite painful knowledge their loved one's death might have been prevented through earlier pattern recognition, that system limitations unfortunately failed, providing before fatal incident occurred, that appropriate protocols might potentially have prevented developing through previous cases, that accountability mechanisms failed adequately addressing before tragedy, that proper response might have averted had system effectively functioned, identifying pattern evidence subsequently established existed before fatal incident, that justice process ultimately documented through comprehensive investigation. Detective Marchand specifically provided ensuring appropriate resolution, despite institutional challenges case initially faced before evidence created sufficient momentum, ensuring continuation. Despite reluctance, certain officials demonstrated before case strength, eliminated protection possibilities. Social status might otherwise have provided absent compelling evidence, contradicting accident classification initial response nearly permanently established.